Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Katherine Stewart. Katherine is a journalist and author who's been covering the rise of the anti-democratic movement for over 16 years. Her writing appears in the New York Times, New Republic, and many others. Her 2012 book, The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, focused on the religious right's efforts to undermine public education. Her next book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, won first place in the Nonfiction Books category from the Religion News Association, formed the basis of the documentary feature God and Country. And her latest book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, is the book we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about the evolution of conservatives to the far right and how that's happened over the past 20 years. We talk about critiques of the far right and when to really critique and critique well. We talk about her idea of reactionary nihilism on the far right and the anti-woke movement. We also discuss issues such as abortion, conservative conventions, religion, and many other topics. It's a really, really important conversation. Katherine has been in the trenches, so to speak, going to these conventions, going to these big rallies, doing all this work within the far right and trying to really understand it from the inside out. And she's quite passionate about it and is really trying to help us understand what's going on inside the far right, what's happening in many parts of the United States. And her book is very, very valuable in that way. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. And so get over there, like, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Katherine Stewart. I am here with Katherine Stewart. Katherine, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, it's great to chat with you today.
Yes, I was just telling you I'm familiar with your previous book, The Power Worshippers, and you have a recent one out. It's Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. So it's important stuff, important topics. So we're going to get all into it. So before we do, just briefly tell folks that don't know who you are, just kind of a bit about yourself. What are the most relevant details?
Sure, thank you. I'm an investigative journalist. I've been writing about the rise of the religious right as a political force and the anti-democratic movement for 16 years. And my two previous books are The Good News Club, which really focused on public education and in particular the religious right's sort of hostility to public education, its efforts to infiltrate and undermine public schools and also divert taxpayer money for private and religious schools. Second book in the field was The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, and that really focused on the religious right as a political force, or Christian nationalism, the Christian nationalist movement, and how it affects different areas of our society. And then Money, Lies, and God is a broader look at the anti-democratic movement more generally. Money, of course, because money is a huge part of the story, meaning vast concentrations of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder have destabilized our political system in some pretty interesting and often non-obvious ways. Second, lies, because conscious disinformation and propaganda and conspiracism is another huge feature of what we're seeing in our politics today. It's another really critical part of the anti-democratic coalition. And then God, because religious nationalism or Christian nationalism is also, I would say, in a way, the most largest part of the, most important part of the ideological feature of the anti-democratic movement, because it's a way of bringing the rank and file on board.
It's interesting because you're mentioning your previous books and this one, and this one does feel like a sort of kind of coming together of some of those things, especially throughout the book, because you do talk about, obviously, Christian nationalism, you talk about kind of the far right's, kind of war on public education. So it does feel like a lot of it comes together here. I guess one general question I have is look, there should probably be a distinction here between, conservatism, right? So I'm saying that kind of in the Burkean sense, right? I don't know if anyone really is a Burkean anymore, but there's like, conservatism as a kind of worldview of sorts, and then you get this sort of Republican Party and the right, kind of broadly, but it's really been on an upward or downward, whichever way you look at it. There's been an evolution of this over the past 45 years. So if you kind of go back in the modern time, Reagan's conservative counter-revolution, we know the story there in the 80s and into the early 90s. You had, Newt Gingrich in the 90s. You get the Tea Party, and, shortly after Obama wins in 2010, and there was, they're all sort of connected there. I guess, how did the right kind of go all the way to the far right? And it seems like it's on steroids now. I mean, because now you have, the MAGA iteration, and, it makes folks like, from, either Bush era look, what do they call them? Rhinos, right? They makes it look like they're, moderates at this point. MAGA is so different, so extreme, embracing all these things. I mean, how, and I don't even want to know what's next. I mean, when you're looking at this trajectory, I mean, what the hell is happening here?
Well, the movement is as strong as it is because of decades of investment in organizational infrastructure. The movement long preceded Trump, but he really gave it rocket fuel. I mean, for a long time, we've had these reactionary forces existing in America. This movement is, by the way, not remotely conservative. It's radical. It wants to tear down the institutions that have served us for decades or longer. But, for years, the GOP really saw the Christian fundamentalist right, which has always rejected the principles of equality and pluralism, right, they saw them as a reliable voting bloc. They believed they could make use of them to advance their economic and social agendas. The GOP did. They thought, well, they're not going to ever vote for a Democrat or anyone, to the left of us. So, we'll placate them and make use of them. What's really changed is that the gatekeeping institutions of the Republican Party, which were, again, making use of those who follow these ideologies, have fallen apart. They're no longer able to resist it. So today, the GOP has been overtaken by extremist Christian nationalist and new right movements, and they're the ones who are running the show. They're essentially feasting on the carcass of the GOP. So, I mean, let's take a minute to look at how unprecedented the threat is right now and how it's not remotely conservative.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of presidential overreach and corruption, we're in a situation without any precedent in American history. Now, to be sure, there have been instances in the past of attempts at presidential overreach. We had Lincoln arguably claiming new wartime powers. We had Wilson suppressing dissent. FDR had a court packing scheme, and so on. But those kinds of efforts occurred mostly in exceptional circumstances like war, right? And they could plausibly claim some appeal to national interest and supporting legal theory. But the Trump administration, on the other hand, is consciously and willfully denying the legitimacy of the Constitution, the judiciary, or any law that places a limit on its action. This is the most lawless administration in American history without exception. Just think about what GOP did when Nixon tried to subvert the Department of Justice. They kicked him out. So this points to another feature. There's always been, corruption in the past. Nixon, of course, and the Harding administration with its teapot domes and so on. But there's never been a president who organized pure upfront grift like Trump's meme coin scheme or social media platform. No president has ever handed an Elon Musk-type oligarch who profits directly from government contracts and gets billions in taxpayer subsidies, No president has ever given somebody like that unaccountable and unconstitutional ability to maraud through the government, slashing and burning with impunity and making things frankly less efficient and probably not saving any money whatsoever. So the combination of corruption with authoritarian overreach makes the present situation unique and exceptionally dangerous. And also, I mean, previous conservative presidents have been strong on, or said to be strong on, national security. They've tried to bolster our alliances and sort of double down on not pandering to our enemies. This current president has done absolutely the opposite. I mean, the betrayal of our national security interests is totally without precedent. Now, of course, we've had presidents pursue wrong-headed and destructive foreign policies, but we haven't had any who allies with adversaries in ways that could really only be justified by his own self-interest instead of the national interest. So, the degree of incompetence, corruption, degree of the selfishness, the graft, it's just, and presidential overreach is really, it's hard to figure out. You can't call this remotely conservative. I mean, even those supposed wokety wokesters at the Wall Street Journal are calling Trump's trade wars the dumbest trade war in history. So
yeah, certainly. I mean, it certainly is. I mean, I've heard people try to do the gymnastics on that. It's the art of the deal, and you just don't get it. It's 4D chess and all this kind of stuff. But
no,
I'm not buying it.
No, it's not. No, a lot of what Trump does and MAGA does is very performative.
Yes. So let me give two kind of I guess not rebuttals, but sort of I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I fully agree, and just to even kind of hammer down the point here, people would say, well, we've been at war, and sometimes you need to do things. And the examples you gave, Lincoln was during a civil war, our only and hopefully only civil war. Wilson was during World War One, and FDR was during World War II. I mean, this is the big wars of our country. So, and again, people, they had criticism, that's rightfully so, to get criticism for extreme measures.
National interest, and they could claim some supporting legal theory for what they were doing, for sure. Mm-hmm, and there's nothing that Trump he can't claim national interest for what he's doing, and he can't claim supporting legal theory unless he totally reinterprets the Constitution, which is what his Supreme Court is happy to do.
Yeah, for sure. I guess, we have to have, two things. First, one could say, look, 70 plus million Americans voted for him. Like, this is what, this is what they wanted. This is what this is what we're getting. I mean, that's what people, it wasn't like he, didn't win democratically, X, Y, and Z. That's the first thing.
But I didn't say he didn't win in a fair election. I didn't say that. He did win. And
sure.
Talk about why people voted for him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's important. I'm just giving the sort of kind of rebuttal that someone might give here. But the second thing is on the more kind of left side of things. I think one of the things, this is a hard thing. This is a hard thing on the left. I think it's really, really hard. And this is something I, as a moderate liberal, I'm always trying to find, where to put the actionable things. But here's the thing: we had 4 years of this guy doing a lot of performative stuff. Now, obviously, there were some things that did have consequence for many people. I don't want to minimize, but there are, the first 4 years, we had a horrible tax cut. We had, the bans. We had, the rhetoric. We had all these things, which are pretty terrible. And knowing that he's been president, at the time we're recording this, maybe 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is, and knowing we have 4 years of this guy, my question on this is, we can't react to everything he's doing with sensationalism and like it's the worst and it's unprecedented. And my question to you is, how do we like curate that to know when to pick our spots to say, okay, this is legitimately, he's going to say a lot of wild shit. He's going to do a lot of performative nonsense. But when is it that you pick the moments to say, you know what? If you're a public figure or you're writing on something, there's a lot of things that I strongly and stridently disagreed with, but I didn't say anything or whatever. But this is sort of the line here. I mean, we can't go every week, every month for 4 years saying this is the worst thing ever. Like, how do we pick the moments in those spots, I guess?
Well, I think that, the thing about Trump, this is one of the reasons that the anti-democratic movement likes Trump so much, is he moves the goalposts, and he moves them again, and he moves them again
sure does.
Until they're not even on the playing field. I mean, he's really ripping up all the norms of democracy, and that makes him the perfect leader for a movement that's authoritarian to begin with. I think we can really start with the Constitution. The whole idea of a president is that they take an oath to defend the Constitution, but I don't believe that this administration is even speaking democracy's language anymore. I mean, they'll pay lip service to the Constitution, but in practice, they're ripping it up. They claim to be patriots, but they're speaking authoritarian language. Part of the way they do this is by repurposing the First Amendment. It's really Orwellian. So for decades, when they were talking about cancel culture and free speech, they were pretending it was really about free speech. But now they have the power that they want. They have zero interest in free speech when it involves someone with whom they disagree. They're out there banning books, canceling words like socioeconomic and status and climate science and diverse, covering up displays of female soldiers and black soldiers, and eliminating entire fields of science from the federal government, and eliminating grants for scientific research. This is something that's been an enormous driver of economic wealth in our country, economic stability. It's been it's made us the envy around the world. It's not just been good for America, it's been good for the whole world, and we've been a leader, and he's eliminating that. Think about what he's doing with our soft power, totally destroying it. You know what? Power hates a vacuum. When America steps out, someone else is going to step in. I mean, another kind of speech, by the way, that they use that would make Orwell very proud is their use of the term religious liberty, which in their mouth really means privilege for anyone who shares their view alone. So here's the thing. The Constitution is really clear about the power of Congress to check the president. It's clear that the president can be held liable for crimes, should not be corrupt, enriching himself willy-nilly, and so on. So this is a movement, and the GOP at this point is completely willing to overlook their constitutional responsibilities. The current president is rewriting and remaking laws that by law only Congress can do. And Republicans seem totally okay with that. So, we really are facing a constitutional crisis. We can't think that there's some magic pendulum in the sky that's somehow going to swing back naturally to a state of, imperfect democracy. No. I mean, look at instances throughout history and all over the world. Nations fall and other types of nations rise to take their place.
I totally agree with you. I think, kind of starting with, the Constitution and saying like, look, we're not even getting, past the first door here. I mean, we're failing on the basic things here at the moment. We have to improve on that. Regardless whether you like the guy or he's your guy or things like that, these things aren't okay. I mean, I fully agree with you on that. You mentioned this term, which I thought was strong, but I thought accurate. I hadn't heard it mentioned with this, is, that this, the whole point of the book is that, the far right movement is a threat to American democracy, which I would agree with all the things you just outlined. And you said it is like a reactionary nihilism, which I totally agree. I mean, one of the things that just absolutely gets me worked up is we'll say the far right. The far right is, and I'll pick a little bit on my conservative friends as well, is this idea of they just want to keep things the way it is, and they just, with the far right now, they want to break how things are. It's all anti, which look, I can see some of those things, right? I do think, progressives went a little too far on some things. Okay, that's fine. We reined it back a little bit. Okay, like I can be in that conversation for a little bit. But everything after that continuously is just breaking shit. And it's, we need to do this and we can't have this and all these things. And like, okay, the question I always ask folks that I talk to that are MAGA, or they voted for Trump or whatever, is, but what do you do after that? Like, how do you build something? How do you face problems in the 21st century? How do you make other things work? It can't just be, you can't do this, you can't do this, we're going to bring it back to this, we're not going to have these people, we're not going to do this. Okay, even if you do all that, you have to create, you have to build, and they just don't have any theory of mind on how to do any of that. So, I mean, that whole reactionary nihilism really registered with me, because I was like, that's exactly what it is. That's all they know. It's a one note kind of movement where it's just like, break shit, and people that look like us and talk like us, that's all we're going to be concerned about, and praising the holy leader. I mean, that's really what it seems like at this point.
Yeah, I coined that term because, again, I think it's sort of after observing the movement for 16 years. It's what seemed clear to me. Nihilism is a description of those whose fundamental aim is to destroy rather than create, and who, by their actions, rather than anything they're necessarily saying, deny that there's any real truth or value in the world as it actually exists. And by reactionary, I mean that instead of advancing or progressing toward a better state, they really want to return to some kind of imaginary version of the past that never existed the way they think it did, but that also includes elements of regressive social order, like gender hierarchy, the suppression of certain forms of speech, attacks on the freedoms and religious freedoms of those who fail to conform, etc. So I put those words together to describe the anti-democratic reaction. Now, of course, we all long sometimes for the good old days, and not everybody who does so is a nihilist. But those who believe that a democratic political system and its ideals and institutions are so bad, so broken, they need to be smashed to bits, and at the same time they're exalting a completely fictitious and unrealistic fantasy about the golden age of yore, I think these people count as nihilists. Their vision is based not on reality, it's retreating into a fantasy that's projected onto the past. It's something you talked about when people say, the left has gone too far. Look, don't get me wrong. I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I believe in individual rights. I love the freedom of speech. I'm a journalist. I want to live in society where people are judged not by the color of their skin or their gender, but by the content of their character, right? I'm committed to science. All of this puts me at odds with some of the attitudes that are now mislabeled as woke. But wokeism is frankly a trivial problem compared with what I would call anti-woke derangement syndrome. I mean, it's like saying something like, the grading system at school is so unfair, I have no choice but to plant a nuclear bomb in the school parking lot, or something like that. It's insane. Or it's saying, well, I don't like the way this one babysitter, seems really entitled, and she smacks of sort of class privilege. So guess what? I'm going to leave the children with a convicted child rapist. I mean, it's insane. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You just don't.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you on that. I think, there's probably a handful of listeners that are probably cringing at that, right? Because I some folks probably really did think they go too far on all these things, which I can hear that.
Said, I think they do at times, but that is not the deal that we're facing. I mean, again, think about it again. Okay, I think this is sort of like anti-woke derangement syndrome, in a way, it's an enabler mode. It starts out with the words, what about, right? And then ends up with some unbelievable outrage of supposedly, mainstreamed on the left wokery that, your uncle might have shared with you on Facebook. But what I would encourage people like this to do is go out and take a walk, maybe go to a school gym and get some perspective, okay? Out of over 500,000 athletes in the NCAA, it looks like there might be about 10 trans people playing on the opposite side to the one they're born in, okay? Between 2019 and 2021, there were 56 reported gender change surgeries in the U.S. on people under 18, some of whom had different kind of things going on, and I don't need to talk about it because they were children and whatever. And I'm not saying these issues don't deserve attention from anyone, perhaps those in related fields like endocrinology or sports policy, but they're not worth the billions of words and millions of votes that they have collected. This is not the issue facing our time. Meanwhile, gun violence is the #1 cause of child death and adolescent death in America. Something like 20% of children are living under the poverty line. It might even be a little bit higher. So forgive me for saying, these are issues that should be debated, but they shouldn't be the conversation, the main conversation. The only reason that they are is because the right makes them the conversation. I went to America Fest last December, and it's Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA gathering. It takes place in Phoenix Convention Center, 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters. Every single speaker, I would say maybe 3 out of every 4 speakers, talks about the 10 NCAA out of 520,000 trans athletes, right? Every single speaker. Meanwhile, I could barely hear a mention about poverty. No mentions of gun violence, except from one speaker who was invited as a kind of, okay, now you're going to hear something different. And he's a sort of representative of the left, and talked about big funders on the left, but really failed to talk about the much bigger funders on the right. I mean, the big issues facing our country went unaddressed. The fact is, thanks to massive concentrations of wealth at the very tippy top of the economic ladder, you've got like families that are like, you've got 2 parents, you've got 4 jobs, and they still can't afford a decent life for their kids. The right claims to stand for family values, but they're driving support for politicians whose policies are making it so much harder for most American families to succeed. And these are the issues that we should be talking about. Those issues, those sort of shiny baubles of the culture war issues, are not mainstream within the Democratic Party. There's nothing inherently woke or unwoke about healthcare access, progressive taxation, investments in scientific research, improving public education or infrastructure building or consumer protection policies or common sense gun reforms or defending individual rights. That is what should be occupying the bulk of our discussion, those kinds of issues, supporting our economic security, supporting our foreign policy that's actually making America stronger and not weaker.
Listen, I totally agree with you. And this is why I usually don't talk about these things, not because I don't think they're important, I don't care. It's one of those things where, it's kind of boring at a certain point. There's only so much to say about it, but it just
feels like one has to shower after you talk about it, because we shouldn't have to have this much conversation about it. But the right makes it the issue, and they do it to distract people.
Yes.
It's totally deployed for outrage politics. And instead of allowing oneself to be backed into taking unpopular positions, what I think a lot of Democratic politicians need to get is a little bit smarter about saying, you want us to be talking about this thing over here because you don't want us to be talking about this much bigger thing that's right in front of us.
I do agree. So I'll agree with you, and then I'll give a little bit of a difference here. So I totally agree. I've been the same. I've said the same. When I have my friends, they'll send me stuff and they'll say like, oh, well, what about this or this? I'm like, listen, the same thing. There's like less than a dozen trans folks
Right.
in
So
the
I
NCAA. Like
there's so much more to talk about.
we got to keep our eyes on the bigger goals here.
Exactly. We got to keep our eyes on the bigger goals. So let's talk about some other stuff, because this stuff has frankly occupied much too much of our conversation already.
Yes, no, I agree.
About the destruction of our democracy, and I think that is much more deserving of our conversation.
Yeah, yes. I'll just say, like, this is what is problematic, though, right? Is look, there's a lot of this stuff, and I get it. 2020 pandemic. Kind of some of the stuff in the summer 2020. It was a tough time, and there were some things where people went, a little bit too far on some things. Okay, fine, but I think the bigger problem is that social issues, whatever it is, whether it's, critical race theory or all this woke stuff, that stuff has to be dealt with in society, right? We don't need politicians on either side, really, but spending so much time on this. You have, wealth and income inequality. You have poverty. You have people that don't have access to good education, don't have access to healthcare, that they have, as you were mentioning, violence in different ways. All of these things are so much more. If you were to ask me, what do you care about? If you develop a personal hierarchy, what do you care about? I'm sorry, 10 trans folks in swimming is not going to get at the top 10. It's just, it's just not. There's a lot of big issues in the world. That doesn't mean I don't care about trans folks. I do, but I'm just saying, like, this is what's frustrating about this. But I totally agree with you. This backlash that's the other thing that's frustrating, and we don't have to talk about necessarily. We can talk about it more generally. Why in the middle of 2025 we're still the right is still litigating stuff from 2018, 2019, 2020 when it's not even an issue anymore? Like, you have all of these things with education, and kind of to your point, we're free speech now, blah blah blah, but then they're banning books, and they're saying you can't say these certain things, you can't do these things. How do people continue to have so much legs for this? We're talking half a decade later. Like, why are we still talking about these things?
Well, they do their market testing. They, do you know what a shiny, like a laser pointer cat toy is? It's where a little red thing goes on the floor, and the cat jumps and looks at it and doesn't see the bigger picture. These culture wars serve as shiny laser pointer cat toys. For a long time, it was really abortion. They kept on. They still want to ban abortion. Don't be surprised if they go after not just nationwide bans, but also forms of birth control that they choose to characterize as abortion. They lie and they say, Democrats want to abort babies after they're born, which doesn't happen. That's called infanticide. It's not legal. But, and then they're going after abortions, like what they call, morning after pills, which prevent implantation, which prevent pregnancy. Because, some of those culture war issues allow the right to pretend that they're defending women's rights with one hand while they're taking away women's most fundamental rights with the other. And here's the thing. A majority of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, support abortion rights in some form. And anyone who's had kids or been around for a little while knows that you cannot take away the right to abortion without making all pregnancies less safe. I'm one of the many women, many women, like 1 in 4 or 5 known pregnancies ends in miscarriage. And a number of those need medical intervention in order to complete, so that women don't get septic or bleed out or die, right? And I'm one of them. I was in 2003 in a Catholic hospital having between kids. My husband and I, were trying, and I was pregnant, very happily so, and then discovered that, I was bleeding, and, ended up going to the hospital, and I was bleeding in a way that was really not safe. I was hemorrhaging, and I was in a Catholic hospital because I was taken there by ambulance, and it was the nearest hospital. Ambulances are required by law to take patients to the nearest hospital. They can't pick and choose. And there they let me bleed out, Xavier, until I lost 40% of my blood. Wow. And was going into shock and nearly died before they gave me the abortion that saved my life. But now the data is coming in from states like Louisiana and Texas, where abortion is effectively or completely banned, and women are going septic, women are dying, women are, losing organs, seeing organ failure. I spoke to one doctor who was in a state that didn't allow abortion. She showed up at the emergency room. I'll never forget this story. As a young mom having a miscarriage, they were not allowed to treat her, and finally she was transferred to his hospital, where they were allowed to treat her. So first she went to a different hospital. They let her just, oh, you got to get septic before we can do anything. He treated her. He said she was so sick that she ended up, with some of her organs failed, and she ended up in a long-term care facility. Long-term care facility. A young, vibrant mother, for no reason other than some ridiculous ideology that says a doomed fetus is worth more than a person's life, than a woman's life. So, we're really seeing the consequences, really deadly consequences of these abortion bans that the right has been after for so long. In fact, in some of the states where they ban abortion, now they're also banning the collection of data around pregnancy-related deaths in hospitals, because they don't want people to know that women are dying. And women are dying. ProPublica has done a pretty good job of collecting some of this information. But so they can't talk about this the way they used to. Before Roe versus Wade was overturned, it was like this grand ideal, and everyone was going to, all the women are going to be happy that they're pregnant, and, it's going to be like a sort of festival of babies. And what's happening is we're getting a festival of death and pain and disability from women whose pregnancies don't go the way they're supposed to. And the right wants to cover it up. So they flipped. Now they can talk about, women-only spaces and, be defending women, even as they're actually harming women in the most fundamental ways, the most fundamental ways.
Yeah, I mean, this is where this stuff has real impact, where people are being harmed or they're not having access. I mean, you're seeing it now with immigration, right? Which is, we knew that was coming. We knew that was going to come, unfortunately, and it's awful that you're reading these stories, and people are. I unfortunately, I feel I've said this to people. A lot of Americans have a strong stomach for that stuff. It's going to have to take a lot for people to really say, okay, this is too far. And I hate that. I hate that we have to get that far for people. Everyone's going to say, well, it's just an isolated incident. Well, what was their background? Well, and you see this as well. You see this where people are being ostracized, and they're being mistreated, all these things for no reason half the time, which is, again, it's another like the abortion thing that you're mentioning. It's another way in which it's, this far right is preying upon people that are, in some cases, didn't do anything, didn't commit anything. And that's, because of all this ideology that they have worked up in their head. But it is very hard to break through that to regular folks that believe it.
It is true. What's happening shouldn't be surprising, because they told us what they were going to do, which is smash the institutions of a functioning democracy. They said they were going to smash the administrative state. And a lot of people are sort of confused. What is an administrative state? But that's the institutions of functioning democracy. They've, kicked 4 million people off the Social Security rolls, claiming they're dead. I spoke to one of those people who is absolutely not dead. She had to spend 4 hours on the phone, had to go, because they fired a lot of the people who were answering the phones. They said, you got to come to the office. She drove hours away to the Social Security office in her state. Spent, a day or two, better part of, 2 days trying to deal with this, said to them, look, I'm alive, and then thought it was all sorted out. And then next week, the same damn thing happened. So, real people are getting hurt. I think rural support for Trump is down, because his ridiculous trade wars are actually making, ruining markets for some of these rural folks, and making some of their equipment and feed and everything else impossible to afford. But they told us they were going to do it. I mean, Trump told us in no uncertain terms he was going to turn the system of justice into his personal vendetta machine, and that's what he's doing. He promised trade wars, and that's what we're getting. He let everybody know he was going to sell Ukraine down the river and trash the alliance with Europe, and that's exactly what he's doing, and so on. So fundamentally, there's no reason to be surprised. Now, I think the pace of events is a bit faster than one might have guessed, but here again, we knew this time would be different because they had 4 years to plan out this movement. We had Project 2025, which is a 900-page document that was put together by the Heritage Foundation with the collaborative support of over 100 right-wing, religious right, and new right organizations, think tanks, and the like. And they were really quite specific about what they wanted to do. But we also anticipated, I think, that these extremist moves will serve first and foremost to entrench corruption and incompetence in our government.
I guess the question I have on this, you talked about it at different points, is, take yourself, for example. I mean, you've been covering this for a long time. You've been to, probably more conservative conventions than most conservatives have, or people on the far right have. I mean, you've reported on this, you've written about it. I mean, it doesn't seep into you of saying like, actually they made a good point, or, that is true, or, how is it that so many people get bamboozled by this is the question.
It's not that there aren't moments that chime with me at these gatherings. And, but when you look at the bigger picture, you really have to see that this is a movement that hates the principles of equality and pluralism and justice and rule of law that represent the best of the American promise. This is not a movement that really cares about the Constitution. It wants to rewrite the Constitution. It has sort of fantasy ideas about economic security, national interest, and certainly wants privileging of people with certain religious and political viewpoints over others. And that's just antithetical to what America is really about. It's a movement that wants to rewrite history. Now, I think that the movement is very appealing to a lot of people for very clear and obvious ways. It offers, I think folks have a lot of legitimate grievances in the world, especially in a time of grotesque economic inequality, where people are looking at their lives and thinking, well, things were a lot easier for my dad. He could afford to buy a house. My mom could stay home for a few years when the kids were young. The public schools, nobody questioned them. The whole society supported them. Everything seemed to work a little better. Why are things so much harder for me? Why can't I make it the way my parents did? And this is a movement that harnesses those grievances and status anxiety, which a lot of Americans suffer from because we've got these images of super wealthy always being shoved in our faces, and promises easy answers. It says, well, if you can just hate on these people, or this group over here is responsible for all your problems. A lot of the hardcore Trump supporters are people that the knowledge economy left behind. They're not exactly poor. They're disproportionately white, but not entirely, but I would say disproportionately. But they're not poor, but they're also not wealthy. They're often people who are sort of, I would say, in the lower middle ends of the economic spectrum. They're less educated than others. They're not, necessarily glued to the news the way I might be. They perhaps don't really understand the role of fact checking. So, people can criticize the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, or the owner of the LA Times, et cetera, for what they do, or Disney. But I don't think that's the problem. The folks, the hardcore MAGA, are being subject to a constant stream of disinformation and misinformation that is, deploying culture wars for the politics of outrage, finding people and groups to blame for their problems and people to blame for societal collapse. And I think they're being promised that, well, if things just revert to how they supposedly used to be and everyone would just stay in their lane, right, then things will be a lot better, and we can revert to a sort of, again, a state where life isn't quite so hard for me, and I'll feel a little bit better. The movement is also really very good at tapping into both, I would say, explore, like acknowledge, but also unacknowledged prejudices. It's very good at that. There's a lot of kind of signaling that happens in these spaces. And they do articulate a positive vision of America. This is something that I think the moderate liberal left could really learn from the right. They, a few things. Number one, they go after their base and they turn it out. They don't. They're not going after people on the left and saying, how are we going to get those people? No, they're turning out their base because they know if you turn out your base in disproportionate numbers, you can win. They go after low propensity voters because those folks are a lot gettable than people whose identities are firmly on the other side of the political aisle. And then they do, even though they're talking about how America's facing an apocalypse thanks to wokeness or whatever, and therefore the rules don't apply anymore, and we need a strong man and a dictator. They're actually, when they're not talking that way, when they're not doing this sort of apocalypse talk, they're articulating a positive vision of America. They're saying, ladders to climb if you choose to climb them. Our country is the greatest in the world, and they're sort of rallying people around a kind of image of the flag. But make no mistake, they can wrap themselves in the flag, but they really are endorsing the most un-American ideas imaginable.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what's very depressing about it in a large sense. And I get people have frustrations, and a lot of times, like you were saying earlier, when there's a void and people aren't stepping up, it's like, well, this is the only person here. I mean, well, I guess this will do, and then you can rationalize and then double down afterwards. But I guess the one thing that's curious to me, and you've written about this a lot, so maybe you could just talk about it generally and be specific if you want with examples, is why we see religion get involved. Well, I should be very specific here, kind of this Christian fundamentalism, this kind of, reformed, very traditional kinds of ways of, religion getting involved with the far right movement. I mean, there's so many things about this administration and the far right generally that are just antithetical to any Christian values. It's just so obvious that it's antithetical, and yet there's this. It started with some televangelists and maybe some folks that are kind of legitimate charlatans, but it's fully kind of embraced with at least Christianity. I mean, many Baptist organizations and Methodist, big denominations, big churches, big universities, Christian universities have fully out and out supported MAGA and Trump and all these things. I mean, what's the story there about religion, especially a Christian religion, just fully embracing it? I mean, I've never quite really understood that.
Yeah, it's a identity politics. Religious nationalism is a kind of exclusionary form of nationalism. It's about who gets to properly belong in the country and who doesn't. And Christian nationalism is the most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction, arguably, because it motivates a lot of the voters or local activists, people I refer to in my book as the foot soldiers. Now, many of them might not themselves identify as Christian nationalists, but with their actions, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. I also write in my book at length about these very political pastors. Movement leaders know if you can get people to vote on a certain single issue or 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. They also know that pastors are often the most trusted voices in their communities. So they draw pastors into networks like Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall and Church United. They have pastor networks devoted to Latino pastors or Black pastors as well. They have, or different pastors in different regions, or pastors who are, in the sort of Pentecostal / independent charismatic network vein. And they give them very sophisticated, not just talking points to turn out their congregations to vote, data tools. They give them videos to air at church, sermon starters, and things like that. And they persuade these pastors to even instructions for forming teams in their churches, they call them community impact teams, where if the pastor doesn't feel comfortable talking about politics and doesn't want to run afoul of their tax privilege status, they can find congregants who are willing to do it for them, right? So that they're not directly involved. And then they know very well, in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, if you can mobilize your base in disproportionate numbers, if you can get a church to turn out 95% of its congregants to vote for a particular candidate, you can really swing a district that will swing a state and therefore swing an election. So in advance of the 2024 presidential election, the religious right leaders identified 19 swing districts in 7 swing states. And they did the mapping, and they very systematically went after the churches in these swing districts, in these swing states, the conservative churches, mind you, not the liberal churches, and flooded those zones with materials to get those churches to turn out their congregants to vote.
Mm. Yeah, I mean it's quite sobering in a lot of ways, and again, it's this idea of, it was Jefferson who wanted to have a separation of church and state, where we have all, freedom of religion. And it just never really quite feels that way. I would just say the other thing is people, the thing that frustrates me the most, I'll say, you tell me what you think about this, is it's really the double standards, right? That really gets to me, right? Because people hold political office, whether it's the president or a politician or whatever. And there's that kind of famous viral clip that came out a couple months ago, or maybe a month ago, with Obama saying, if I had done 5% of this, I would have been my political career would be over.
Yeah,
and I just can't understand that. I can't understand why people keep giving Trump for so long, he's totally nothing impacts him. It's you just call it both ways. If somebody's taking a plane from any other government as a quote unquote gift, if Bush or Obama or Clinton or Biden did that, I mean, people would be so oh my God, up in arms. And it's just yeah, well, it's not a big deal. Why, it's just and that's just one small thing. I mean, it's just anything. It's never called the same way. And I don't understand why, with him specifically, it's never on an equal playing field with that stuff. I don't. What do you make of this? I never understand that.
Well, the rules, he acts like the rules don't apply to him, and they don't, because his own party doesn't hold him accountable. And in a way, he's the perfect leader for an authoritarian movement. It's a movement that has never believed in the principles of democracy or pluralism. It believes in tiers of rights, one tier for us and everyone else is on a lower tier. And, double standards are really hard to, it's not a fair playing field. If your own party won't hold you accountable and doesn't want to, they just want to break democracy. And so this is why they refer to him as a king, King Cyrus, or an imperfect ruler God chose to enact his will. Here's the thing about kings. They're not kings of democracies. They're a law unto themselves. So they're the perfect representatives of authoritarian movements. This is what dictators do.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's, more alarming, because as people continue to double down, we're early in the second term. 4 years is a long time. I mean, if your own party and your own people aren't holding you accountable, that's scary stuff. That's scary stuff. So the last question here is, at the end of the book, you talk about, these 6 principles. I'll just list them real quick. We're still in the majority. They're divided. Separation of church and state. Extreme levels of material inequality are eroding democracy. Knowledge is power, and organization matters. What can people do to kind of try and do something to combat some of the threats to American democracy? Well,
first, I think we need to get out of bed. This is no time to hide under the covers. This is a time for moral courage. This is the fight of our time. And if not for yourself, then for future generations. And it's, not going to be easy, but there is no feature of our system as of yet that means MAGA is going to rule indefinitely. And if there's will to get it done and we, behave in a smart way, then it can be done. No guarantees, of course, but it's possible. Second, I would say there's absolutely no substitute for getting out the vote. The right knows this. I mean, much of the Christian nationalist movement functions as a giant voter turnout machine. Again, if they can turn out their voters in disproportionate numbers, which they do, they're able to dominate in election cycles, especially if they're really strategic about targeting certain swing districts and swing states. They just figure out where it has to happen. We have elections in less than 2 years. And it's really important to impress upon people the necessity of not just voting in presidential elections, but voting, in other elections as well, and voting all the way down the ballot and voting for pro-democracy candidates, candidates who believe in basic democratic principles. I would say that, knowledge is power. We can't really fight what we're facing unless we understand it, unless we understand how it's working and sort of tools that they use. I've written my last 3 books, my 3 books in this field, to show how they did it. It's not a mystery. They, it's a decades-long project, but they invested in organizational infrastructure of a movement that functions as a voter turnout machine and a messaging machine. Now, is there money on the political moderates and political liberals? Of course there is, but the money is often spent differently. I would say that I'm going to call it the left for whatever, just for the pro-democracy side, they invest in, I would say, technocratic solutions and sometimes more in individual politicians. So they might, find somebody who they think is a worthy politician and build up their war chest. Well, guess what? That person might not need a war chest, might be big enough. And sometimes the technocratic solutions that they're investing in to certain social problems, those groups are operating in silo. They're really not operating in collaboration with other groups. And what the right does is they invest their money in deeply networked infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, and in individuals, so that individuals with the right sort of ideological approach know that they can shore up their career. They can sort of secure their economic future within this movement. And so if one of the politicians they like, for instance, loses their, the network will throw its support behind the politician. You're not just giving the politician money. And if the politician loses their race, well, the network is still there and can, throw its support behind some other politician. Whereas if a Democratic politician, I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, with an oversized war chest, loses their election, well, that money pretty much goes away. So I think that, I've been pretty conscious about showing the different features of how this movement works in terms of the policy side, in terms of the legal advocacy side, in terms of the sort of pastoral side, in terms of the all the different networking side, the way that they have these networking organizations that get leaders of different organizations together and get them all on the same page and bring them together with deep-pocketed funders. So I think, that last point I talk about, organization matters, this is really critical for the long term.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I couldn't agree more with the idea of keeping the eyes on the prize. What are the essential things? Being organized, getting out and, obviously voting in presidential, but local elections, things like that. So your book is very, very, very good for that. It gives us a big picture into things and what we can do. And so you're doing all of the tough work out there. So a big thanks, Katherine, for coming on the podcast and telling us all about it. And I wish you all the best in all the work. You're going to continue doing it. You're going to be busy the next 4 years. So Godspeed in one sense. So, but yeah, big thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate it.